Hi. Thank you once again for having me on this panel to talk about this turbulent transitional period of our lives, the transition from adolescence to adulthood. A period of initiation, identity, and intimacy. Now, this period of our lives is from about 17 to 25 years, though new research suggests this age range is potentially starting earlier and finishing later. Some researchers believe that modern social, economic, and environmental factors force an extension of this transition between adolescence and adulthood, naming it the new transitional period of emerging adulthood. In previous generations, for Western post-industrial communities, this is the time where we would graduate high school, move on to college or full-time work, and start to think about settling down. The identity and the interests and passions of our adolescence setting the scene for our future career trajectory. But is that still the case? Now, according to pioneer Soviet neuropsychologist Lev Vygotsky, our socio-cultural context plays a large role in our development. And we can see in the creation of the emerging adulthood transition. So the modern socio-cultural context is that houses are more unaffordable, leaving adolescents to live with their guardians longer. All genders are more likely to attend university and most likely want to work full time. And we're having children later in life compared to previous generations. So of course, adolescence is just extending. So, using Vygotsky's theory, our socio-cultural context is the reason why this transition between adolescence and adulthood is seemingly happening later and later. Now, according to Vygotsky, another part of becoming a young adult is that we use tools or artifacts to help us. There are things that are external to ourselves that assist our learning and growth. They could be things, people, or places. But what tools do we use in this transition? Perhaps a tool we use is university, a place of new friendships, of social networks, where different expectations are placed on late adolescents that require a new set of skills. They help us develop. University, as a tool, is important as it expands our knowledge. It requires a certain sense of individual autonomy and self-management. But not everyone, cross-culturally or across socio-economic positions, goes to university. So then the school-to-work transition is also seen as pivotal, providing adolescents with the financial means to move out of the family home and perhaps think about starting a family. Two big events that occur within this transition. Now, looking through another lens at development, we can use Erikson's psychosocial crisis theory to see that this transition is really the shift from identity versus role confusion in our adolescence to intimacy versus isolation. Now, this shift is in stages is so important to individuals, as this is the time when we figure out the role we will play in society and really cement our identity in the future trajectory. Now, according to one researcher, Bay, at the end of adolescence, a reintegrated sense of self, of what one wants to be or to do, and one's appropriate sex role should be or will be developed. Now, this shift is all about using what adolescence has taught us about ourselves, our identity and our morals and our values, and using it to connect and move on to more meaningful relationships and careers. Many developmental psychologists agree that development happens across the lifespan and is a series of challenges that give us an opportunity to grow or to stunt, and this transition is no exception. If we have centered a strong identity based on our values and passions in adolescence, our intimacy crisis that we face in adulthood will only benefit. But then the question becomes, how can we study this transition from a research perspective? I ask the panel. Now, as one of the most important transitions that occur in our lifetimes, further research into how we experience it is not only valuable, it's a necessity. I believe, with respect to research design, the most appropriate kind of study would be a sequential study. Now, this takes the best elements of both longitudinal and cross-sectional studies and studies different cohorts over different time periods in waves, really. We could start with 17-year-olds in 2021, 17-year-olds in 2023, and 17-year-olds in 2025, and track their growth over the years. We could, for instance, track if their career they thought they would have after high school is indeed the one they are pursuing. A sequential design is helpful in seeing cohort effects. This kind of study would really be beneficial in seeing if the idea of emerging adulthood is supported and valid. But to highlight this valuable research design to the panel, I thought I would share an example of what they have already investigated using it. Now, in a past sequential study looked at the political attitudes of adolescents as they grew into young adults using this kind of design. And they investigated how Dutch children between 12 and 31's level of ethnocentrism, that's the idea that your ethnic identity is the norm, changed over this transitional period of their lives between three waves in 91, 94 and 97. Now, the study also interviewed each respondent's parents, which I believe is a great way to get a deeper, more well-rounded understanding of things that when we're investigating children, you know, they have parents have such perspectives about their children that perhaps even the children don't have. I would include this in any study that I would design. I think it's a great idea. They found the effect of educational level on ethnocentrism increased with age. The more education you have, the lower your ethnocentrism goes down. Whereas the effect of gender diminished, so the idea that your gender would impact this at all grew less as you grew older. It's really interesting stuff. It really, with sequential research design, we can see these kinds of patterns emerging and get some really interesting data about how people grow up and how people's perspectives of the world change. Now, the biggest drawback to this kind of sequential study is the cost. It's very expensive to study so many cohorts over so many years. But I believe at the end of the day, the outcomes are really worth it. Another issue with this kind of design is practice effect, which this is when participants in the first cohort, you know, they anticipate what the answer should be by the second and the third cohort that they kind of practiced, and, you know, their answers may become distorted. But at the end of the day, I think it's really worth it. This transition is so important, and I think that's why it's so important to study. I think we as individuals feel that. It's probably why it's such a stressful point of our lives. We feel the weight of our future on our shoulders when we're coming up in those ages. And I think Erickson really summed up what it feels like to go through this point. He said, "To be adult means, among other things, to see one's own life in continuous perspective, both in retrospect and prospect. By accepting some definition of who he is, usually on the basis of some function in an economy, a place in a sequence of generations, and a status in the structure of society. The adult is able to selectively reconstruct his past in such a way, step for step, that it seems to have planned for him. Or better yet, he seems to have planned it himself." Thank you. Thank you for having me on the panel, and back to you.